Hey, Ray. How are you?
I'm okay, Philip. Great to be here.
Yeah, I'm so thrilled that you're here. As we talked about, we wanted to take advantage of Ray being coming through here and him having been in Shanghai for how many months now?
4 months.
4 months, and you were teaching there, right?
Right, at NYU Shanghai.
And it was a political course, correct?
Yes, and that made it even spicier.
Yes, we want to hear about that. So what we're going to do is we're going to talk about that. We're going to talk about some of him breaking in and surviving journalism and some of the hardships that he has gone through, and then we're going to talk about his personal projects. Is that okay with everyone? Okay. I've been told not to spend too much time on China. Okay, we won't do that. But what I'm going to do is throw a smattering of different things that you can hear of what Ray says, and then when we get to the question and answer thing, you'll kind of know where he's coming from, and then maybe that'll spur some questions from you.
You're so democratic, getting permission from the audience on what you're going to...
This
Let's
is all
just
about
give it to them.
interaction, yeah.
Let's just-
All right, so I haven't told him we're going to do this. So to get all the China stuff out of the way really quickly, and then we'll delve down, I'm going to do almost an equivalent of speed dating, all right? And what I want you to do is I'm going to make a statement, and I want you to say agree or disagree, yes or no. I know it's going to be hard for you to do that.
That is hard.
I know it is. But I want you, so the audiences know where you stand, okay? China is the rising power. The U.S. is a declining power. And it's only a matter of time before China becomes number one. Agree or disagree?
Disagree.
Okay. I thought you would. Okay. China, in reality, is a paper tiger and is going to fail due to structural issues connected to its politics, economy, environmental, and demographic challenges. Agree or disagree?
That's too categorical. Disagree.
Okay. Xi Jinping has a plan to become number one by 2049, truly, and is intentionally positioning China as an alternative to American democratic and liberal values.
Agree.
Interesting. Okay, we'll talk about that because I know that's something you've been thinking about. And finally, we got to always ask this, all right, even though you're not necessarily an expert, but everyone's got opinion. China will invade Taiwan within the next 10 years. Agree or disagree?
Ooh, if you had picked a different figure,
What figure
I'm going
do
to
you want
say
to-
disagree.
Disagree. Okay. All right. So you all know where Ray stands on this stuff, on these questions. You could ask him later when we get to the Q&A. I will just follow up with these questions, allow you to elaborate a little bit on a few of them. Okay. So, we all know China. You've just been in China. Ray, you know a lot. You know so many things about so many different topics. You've spent a lot of time there, and you probably have done, a lot of observations and sort of things that have happened. So what surprised you most about when you first got there, all right? And reflecting, did that still hold, or was there another surprise that came about? I mean, again, just as a stage, setting the stage, 12 months ago, we had the 100th anniversary of the Chinese Communist Party. We had Xi receiving his third unprecedented term. China and Xi being much more robust and bombastic in his rhetoric about foreigners. And then we have the domestic tensions that are occurring right now in China with the housing bubble, obviously the unhappiness about zero COVID policy and the reversal. We have, a lot of publicity was given to the aging of the population and what they may mean. So what surprised you most about your time in China?
I got to China in mid-August.
Yep.
And it had only been 3.5 years since the previous time that I was in Shanghai. And it was apparently, perceptibly, obviously richer.
It was.
Than it was just 3.5 years ago.
In what way that you saw?
People were better dressed. They had more and better stuff. On my block, where my apartment was, I would walk home from the metro, and it was Porsche, Land Rover, Tesla, Audi, Porsche, lining the streets on the way to my apartment. It is a place where even if you don't see it for a fairly short period of time, the skyline was different from what it was 3.5 years ago. It's not like the scene setter shot of a New York movie where it takes you a second to look at it and think, okay, this must be the 90s because that's not there and that's not there. In China, it's like, this must be 2 years ago because that's not there and that's not there. It's remarkable. And the first time I was there in 2011, you could see that that was coming. But it takes you a little bit of time to take in what a country is like when its GDP has increased 45 times in 30 years.
Mm-hmm.
It's so astonishing that it takes you a while to drink it all in. That's a lot.
Okay. So in my speed questioning, you said two things that seemingly contradictory. China's the rising power, U.S. is declining power. It's a matter of time. You disagreed. But then you kind of said, China has, you're intimating China has some serious issues on that side. And why did you equivocate? What did you see?
I talked to a lot of people. They didn't realize I was pumping them for information. They thought I was just making conversation. There is an undertow of pessimism that's partially from the pandemic restrictions, partially from what they perceive as narrowing horizons. If you talk to somebody who's 35, they remember the early times in the go-go years. They remember going to high school around the turn of the century and feeling like we are just going to run through the next 100 years and become the world power. And those same people, now that they're in their adult years, are seeing a government that used the pandemic as a way to dig further into their private lives, dig further into their personal lives, be able to surveil them more closely, be able to track not only their literal physical movements, but what they do online, what they spend their money on. There is a sense that among a lot of Chinese I spoke to that Xi Jinping and the party have used the pandemic to strengthen and deepen their reach into private life in China in a way that they had hoped would be moving in the opposite direction by now.
And do you think that, is there a sense that people, did you feel like people wanted to do something about it, or was there just a resignation that there's nothing that they could do?
Well, a lot of them truly feel that there's not anything they can do about it. People who have contacts outside the country, people who have experience outside the country that could lead to possibilities for visas and employment or further education are getting out. I was in the midst of the demonstrations in Shanghai at the end of November, which were astonishing.
Yeah.
For a country of such complete and thorough control to now suddenly have streets packed with people chanting for the government to resign, to stop the COVID restrictions, and every time the police started to push them around, they'd start singing the national anthem. Maybe they don't have many demonstrations in China, but they knew what to do. And at that demo, I talked to one guy who spoke great English and said as soon as he could, he was going to Canada. He was laying the groundwork now. He was making the plans now. He was going to Canada. And on my other side was a guy who had okay English. He was a university student. And he said, I don't have any contacts outside the country, and I'm really scared about what the next years are going to be like, what it's going to be like to be a working adult in this country. It's a terrible thing to hear a young person say, to hear a 20, 21-year-old person say, that they already have this hopelessness about the signs that they clearly see about the powers clearly gathering in fewer and fewer hands in a society that for a time, looked like it was opening up to the rest of the world.
So I find that really interesting because, kind of what you're talking about, what you experienced, is very similar to what I experienced 3 years ago as well. When you had, a young, mobile, upward professional with a small family, they wanted to leave China. They wanted to get to the United States. They were living in the country. They said it doesn't work anymore. The pollution's really bad, and they wanted to leave. And implicitly, there was sort of a political aspect to that. How does that work with the other question that I asked you about? When I asked you, China is positioning itself as an alternative to American democratic liberal values. And in a sense, does Xi really have a plan to become number one? I mean, based on the conversations that you obviously had with students and other folks, what's your sense? And again, China's an elephant, right? In the sense that depending on what part of the animal you grab, they're going to say different things. But, these are data points.
Well, I think China has spent the last 30 years becoming indispensable. What Xi Jinping read as a lesson from that growing centrality in the world order was that he doesn't need foreign experts. He doesn't need foreign consultants. He doesn't need internationally trained and educated people. He doesn't need foreign advisors. China, now being the world's workshop, is powerful enough to reverse the polarity of these relationships and say, we will call our own shots now because we are so powerful that we don't need your consultation, we don't need your permission, we don't need your deference. We will tell you what the terms of our relationship are. I was struck by how often the century of humiliation came up. This is a time in Chinese history when world powers were able to just hive off pieces of China, create exclusive economic zones, and dictate the terms of trade to this big, powerful, and potentially rich country. They look back at that time as a terrible, terrible embarrassment. And now they're getting their own back. They bring it up enough and in strategic enough places that it still rankles. It's the burr in Xi's saddle. There is a very, very strong feeling that this country, this huge, amazing, diverse country, wasted a lot of time. And it wasn't because the West was particularly talented or ambitious or inventive or any of those things. China wasted time, and now it is going to make up for that. It's not the reaction of a confident, self-confident country. Mm-hmm. It's the reaction of a country that is more interested in settling scores than in showing its own magnanimity now that it is powerful and increasingly rich. That was telling to me.
So you feel that then that is what is, so that's why you feel this desire to be the alternative to the West and the desire to be number one is sort of payback? Is that what we're thinking about?
There's an aspect of that. There is also a defensiveness about the post-World War II international order, the Bretton Woods organizations, GATT, the WTO, the sort of global handbook for how things run. They're saying those are not products of our system. They are not products of our interests. They are things that we had to do business with in order to get what we wanted. But now that we are in the position that we're in, we increasingly create our own weather, we create our own gravity, we create our own polarity. When Vladimir Putin comes to Beijing, one of the few Western leaders who went to the games during the pandemic, yes, I can virtually throw my arms around him, even though he wants to sit 40 feet away from me at the dinner table, and we can be BFFs, and I don't have to care what anybody else thinks about it. Yes, I think China was caught flat-footed by the invasion of Ukraine, and we can talk more about that. But it is interesting that China has said virtually nothing publicly about that invasion, even though it was blindsided, even though it values stability, even though it was a major trade partner of Ukraine, even though this creates the kind of conditions that China hates.
Right.
He will not knuckle under to NATO and the General Assembly and all these other people and say, wow, maybe you shouldn't have done that. He won't say it.
Okay, so for those of you, if you want to ask questions to Ray, we're going to move on now because I've been told that we're going to go to the second bucket here that we want to explore. Okay, thank you for that. Plenty of questions from that to ask a little bit later from you all. So we're going to move from sort of your experience in China. I think people here want to hear more about you. And the way I looked at it and I thought about it is there's the professional side. There's a deeply personal thing of what you've gone through, and then how most recently, because of COVID, and I think for a lot of us as well, how both the professional and the personal sort of suddenly came together as we found working at home, we're both doing both of those things all at once. So let's talk about sort of the journalist aspect. I think there are a lot of young people here. I think they would learn a lot sort of from your experience, and we'll sort of touch upon that. We could talk a whole hour, 2 hours about that, but we're just going to touch on some things. So you started working in radio at a student station in New York, right? NYU.
WNYU FM, the sound of the 70s.
Okay, sound of the 70s. This is 1974, okay? Since then, you've traveled the world, and you've reported from everywhere on the most pressing issues. But when you started in this industry, radio, television, it was really hard for someone with your background to break into. How did you do it?
I was lucky, and I think skilled, like I brought something to the table, but without the luck, all the skill in the world wouldn't have mattered. I also made some of my own breaks. So when I couldn't get a job in radio out of college, I went into print and worked at a trade magazine, and then propelled myself to London and had a very successful time as a freelance there.
How did what do you mean by propel yourself to London? What does that mean?
Well, I went to school on the regs for being able to live there and work there legally.
Yeah.
Then I got my then employer to write a letter saying I was his European correspondent. The place where we were working didn't have a European correspondent, but as long as I had that letter, I could get working papers in Britain. And once I had those working papers, I could work for British employers, even though the intent of the document was just to allow me to be there as the European correspondent for Paper Trade Journal, the biweekly journal of the North American pulp and paper industry. I know you all read it, so it's... And I parlayed that into working on Fleet Street. I was a producer at Britain's first commercial all-news radio station. Then there was an earthquake in southern Italy, and people were really caught kind of flat-footed. There was very little coverage, and somebody said to me, you could probably make a go of it in Rome. John Paul had just recently come to the Vatican. The Solidarity trade union movement was on the rise in Poland. And so I moved to Rome, got legal working status there, and worked there, and happened to be walking into St. Peter's Square when the Pope was shot.
Wow.
And from there came a lot of work for a freelance, and I thought, I can do this. I can do this.
Yeah.
And then I went back to New York as a producer for ABC Radio Network. And when I wasn't making any headway there, I went to CNN as a Los Angeles correspondent.
Yeah, I remember.
And learned TV, and I mean, I don't want to hurt anybody's feelings. Hated living in LA.
We're in San Francisco. That's okay.
Okay.
Sorry.
No, but there may be travelers in
Yeah.
the group. It just wasn't for me. I mean, I'm sure there are people who find value and purpose in their lives there, and I don't doubt that. I just couldn't stand it. And and count as one of the happiest days of my adult life when it was shrinking in my rearview mirror on I-10 as I was riding out of there. You'll cut this part out, right?
Yes,
for syndication.
Yeah.
I worked in Chicago for 7 years, a great place to be a reporter. And then when NBC didn't want to take better care of me than it was taking, I went to NPR and became the host of Talk of the Nation, and put that show securely on its feet and drove it to new heights in audience and carriage, and was very, very happy at NPR.
Okay.
Huge mistake to leave. What are you going to do?
So the industry has gone through, the journalism industry has gone through an incredible number of changes over the course of the time that you've been a journalist. A lot of journalists have left journalism. They've become pundits. Some gone to think tanks. You have the rise of cable TV, proliferation of the internet, public media, all the things that are happening now, Fox News, and now podcasting and on-demand streaming. And you've gone through, as I alluded to, personal challenges as well as the professional challenges in this new time. I think journalists generally have been experiencing that, and we'll talk about that in a second, okay? But I want to ask for you sort of big picture, and this is, I think, in an uncertain sort of time, how has your mindset been to remain relevant and vital during these transitions? I mean, you've landed on your feet for the most part. You've gone through adversity, but you've maintained that. So what do you think? Is there anything that you can point to?
I tried to adjust when I had no choice but to adjust. The business has changed beyond all recognition from the day I first walked into a newsroom to earn a paycheck in 1976. That radio station, WNEW-AM, one of America's great radio stations at the time, broadcast in a format that no longer exists, to an audience that no longer exists.
Can you
Sure.
specific?
It was an MOR radio station, which is middle of the road. It presumed to talk to an audience 25 to 65 years old. Imagine any media product in the 21st century saying, oh yeah, we talk to people 25 to 65 years old. It was a tremendously important place in broadcasting history, and now it doesn't even exist anymore. To tell you what the business has done, it's now Bloomberg Radio 1130 and is basically a stock ticker as a radio station. From 25 to 65 to the tiny universe of people who want to get constant updates on stock prices. From broadcasting to narrowcasting. It is emblematic of what's happened to everything. Time, Newsweek, Life, Look, presumed to talk to great big slices of America. Now, half of them don't exist anymore, and the other two, Time and Newsweek, are like faint shadows of their former selves. because the audience for a news weekly, a weekly magazine, doesn't even exist anymore. You know everything now that would have been in time when it came through your mail slot. The immediacy, the constant supply of content, the 24-hour nature of the news means that there's nothing that you don't already know that even is in tomorrow morning's paper. So what the paper has to do is changing as well. The power relationship between audience and media outlet has changed. So we are now saying, you tell us what you want. We're afraid of you. We're afraid that you're going to leave the room. So we're going to shout to try to get you to stay in the room. And I'll never forget, I was at a seminar at the University of Chicago, and a guy from a major electronics producer came in and showed us this machine, and he had a big silver disc on which there was a 1-hour Nightline documentary about Israel and the Palestinians. He pops it in the machine. You don't have to wait till 11:30 to watch Nightline. You don't have to wait till 10 to watch the documentary. And you can choose what you want to watch. So he said, here, let me show you. If you want to watch the part about the Israelis, you just push this. And then if you want to watch the part about the history of the conflict, you can just push this. So I said, and if you don't want to watch the part about the Palestinians, you can do that, right? And he said, oh, absolutely. And he didn't understand why a room full of journalists would find this horrifying. We work really hard trying to figure out, we're going to tell you this part of the story so that when we tell you this part of the story, you'll understand it. Because there's a predicate. We've laid a foundation. But we just spent the last 30 years telling the audience, you can watch, you can not watch, you can become your own program director, you can become your own executive producer, you can stack this show however you want, and you can skip the parts that you don't want to watch. That's anathema to somebody who worries a lot about exposition and sequence and chronology. And for if you're just hawking electronics, it's so what?
Yeah. Okay, thank you. So let's then shift to the personal, and we can kind of see how that kind of combines now as we all have experienced the personal and the professional sort of combining together. You left NPR, then you went to Al Jazeera in America in 2016, and when it went under, you left without a job. Right? Your jobless, not having a job, which all of us have experienced in various forms, was compounded by a diagnosis of cancer. You experienced what you called ageism in the industry, which I think is prevalent in a lot of places. Particularly, we're here in San Francisco as well. And you even, one of the things that he's doing in addition to our the podcast, the World Affairs podcast on Shifting Ground, he's the host of Going for Broke, which we'll talk about in a second too, and Things I Thought About When My Body Was Trying to Kill Me podcast. Okay, so you faced, even as a well-known national journalist, okay, doing the things that you have done, CNN, NPR, Talk of the Nation, you faced a really hard time finding a job, and then COVID hit. Okay? Now, I will tell you, I was here at World Affairs. I had just joined. I had all these sort of big plans for what we were going to do, had a budget. Our board was ready to spend a lot of money. COVID hit. Everything hit the brakes. We had to shift. Everything changed, right? The world is different now. And Ray wrote this piece because Ray, you and I just had met you because I was in Washington. I think it was that winter, right? It was between 2019 and 2020. We had coffee, and I said, "You got to be with us. You got to stay with. You got to do this on the radio program, and we're changing it around." And I had, and then we're all sort of trying to figure out what happened with COVID and how we're dealing with it. And so we're all focused on ourselves. And then I saw this piece in the Outlook, and it was titled, written by Ray, "Sinking Feeling. I clung to the middle class as I aged. The pandemic pulled me under." I have to say, when I read that, I was thunderstruck, right? And so 2 questions. Maybe what you can do is tell the audience a little bit about this piece, which looks like this. This is why.
Washington Post.
Washington Post, okay? It's pretty amazing. And the reason why it's amazing is because here's Ray, a reporter who reporters are not used to being the story. They don't want to be the story, right? So talk about that and how difficult it was and is, I think, for you still. And I'm of that generation as well. It's not about, I don't like talking about myself per se. How difficult is it for you as a journalist to talk about yourself?
It did not come easily.
Okay.
Let me put it that way. This was after several months of beating the bushes. I misread the situation. When Al Jazeera went under, I thought, look, I have a 35-year resume. I have good work in multiple media. I'll be fine.
Right.
3 books, all still in print, major publishers, critically and somewhat commercially successful, radio, television, I'll be fine. So I didn't get crazy, I didn't panic, and just started looking for work. Nobody would hire me, and worse, I got some invitations to apply for jobs from HR people and headhunters, where I found out afterwards they never really intended to take me seriously as a candidate at all, but they did want to be able to say to their bosses that they spoke to a diverse pool of candidates. That sucks.
Yeah.
And, if I had earned nothing else in all those years of work, I thought I had at least earned the right to be taken seriously.
Right.
And, it hurts, obviously, but also there's the practical matter of not being able to do any in-kind work for the electric company when the bill comes. The gas company doesn't want a podcast. The State Farm doesn't want an essay. There's nothing that you can do except make more money. And when you can't make any money, that is it's a surprising moment.
But and the thing is that COVID just made it so much worse, because I remember talking to you about some of this stuff.
It made it impossible to look.
It made it impossible, right?
Because nobody was hiring. And it also, everybody was just seized up. The gears had seized up inside the business. And I didn't tell anybody about the cancer because, given the kind of reception I was getting in the work in the field, I thought, well, hell, no one's going to hire me then. If they hear that I'm sick, forget it, I'm sunk. So I told nobody. In that article, I was finishing chemo. So I was done by then. And I didn't even mention it in the article.
Right.
I was willing to talk honestly about the challenges of finding work, but not prepared to talk honestly about the problems of advancing age and threatening disease.
So, Ray, the other thing that I remember was the fact that, again, you being a personality, you are in demand, and there are, appearances and things that you could do. People would fly you out and you'd be able to make some honorarium that way. I mean, it's not, depending on what it is, right? That was all gone, right?
That was gone.
I mean, my gosh.
I lost $40,000 worth of lecture fees in 5 weeks.
Yeah, yeah. Okay. So the impact on that, okay, kind of, it seems, I mean, professionally then, okay, can I say that that led to sort of the process of going for broke and led to a perspective perhaps that you would not have had otherwise?
Absolutely.
Okay. Tell
Absolutely.
people about what this
There's
is.
two seasons online of Going for Broke. I invite you to listen to them. It's about downward mobility and the challenges of the current economy. We tell stories of people fighting back against the tide, and won 3 national awards so far. And, you know, it's just good work. But the people who produced it thought of me as a host because I wrote that article.
Right.
So, you know, you cast your bread upon the waters and see what happens. But it isn't mawkish. It isn't poverty porn. It's good, rigorous storytelling about the real challenges in the real economy in 2022 and 2023. And it's good work. And, you know, I had to stop thrashing. I had to stop struggling and gritting my teeth and waving my arms and making myself crazy. Mm-hmm. I had to find a kind of dwell point and think about what the new reality of my adult life was. And once I got to that place, and I was sure I was going to be okay, things started to get better.
Right. And you ponder a question that is a minicosm of what we're all experiencing largely about democracy, capitalism. Is there an alternative? That's the thing that people are talking about now. You talk about, what if we define success in our economy less in terms of profit and more in terms of care, right? And so you ask that question, what have you found?
That it sounds soft-headed and sentimental when actually it's a very rigorous way of looking at the economy. It's just using a different yardstick for what success looks like. If a person who's working full-time has to live in an SRO because the mountain of 1 month's realtor fees and 1 month's deposit and 1 month to pay for your first month of rent is just so insurmountable that they're stuck paying actually more money living in an SRO, that is a structural problem with an economy. If we create record-keeping barriers, what some sociologists call an administrative burden, that in effect keeps people from getting the benefits that they've earned, the benefits legally guaranteed to them by existing law, then that is a structural problem with the economy. So when we put it in terms of a care economy, people saying, oh boy, here we go. How much is this going to cost me? No, it's not about that, because it unlocks the potential of those people who can live in a decent apartment, who don't spend dozens of hours trying to apply for a program that they are supposed to get. And the people who design that administrative burden know that one of the ways it keeps costs low is by making the barriers so high and so impenetrable that some people, a certain percentage of people, will just give up and walk away and not get the benefits to which they're entitled. They know that. And that's not a care economy, that's a cruelty economy. And we ought to be thinking about that. Mm-hmm. If we blithely say, oh, well, hey, gig economy is great. You're your own boss. You set your own hours. You set your own conditions. But you can't save for retirement and you can't buy your own health insurance. There's structurally something wrong with what we're doing, or at least we have to be honest with ourselves about that blithe assurance, oh, hey, you can be your own boss. Ask an Uber driver about how cool it is to be his own boss. Ask, a middle-aged gig worker who's running really hard and just staying right in place, how cool it is to be his own boss. Where he used to work at a company that now still employs him, basically used the machinery of the law, the erector set of established practice, to lay him and all his co-workers off and then hire them back as contractors. So they've just released themselves from the responsibility of providing for their health care, paid time off, sick leave, and all those things. That's not an economy that's designed to get the best out of people.
Okay.
It's a crabs in a barrel economy.
Okay. So let's kind of slide into something that's related, and it's another one of your intellectual pursuits right now, and it's a book project. Okay, you're proudly, Puerto Rican heritage. Did your parents did they come to the United States
In
at
the
what
50s.
age? In the 50s. Okay, my parents came from Korea in the 50s as well. You grew up in New York City, and it's one of the most bustling cities in the world, right? Immigrants everywhere, right? And your book is about that experience. It's about, it's entitled, the planned working title, which is going to come out next year, is called We Are Home. It's planned for publication next year, and I think that, here's an opportunity for all of you to get a preview of what that's going to look like. And so my understanding, and this is what was written to me, the book traces, because I haven't read it, I just read the prologue, right? The book traces the new emerging demographics of the United States from the passage and implementation of the Immigration and Nationality Act of 1965. Okay, so what you're doing is within the context of shifting demographics. I mean, why did you decide to explore this? Why now?
When I watched the guys with torches from Home Depot marching around a statue of Robert E. Lee chanting, "You will not replace us," that got my attention. I have spent a lot of time reading great replacement theory literature in bizarre right-wing websites, and this seemed to me, in the name of Americanism, to me the most shockingly un-American sentiment that could be uttered. And I watched the rise of the previous president and the way he played on people's fears about the way America was changing. And I thought about my own childhood in Brooklyn, and I thought about all the kids I knew who were immigrants, whose parents were immigrants. And I thought, we've done this before, we've always done it. What's different about now? And what's different about now is that the immigrants coming are no longer overwhelmingly white, as they were for all of American history until the 1965 Immigration and Nationality Act. You could not naturalize as an American citizen by law if you weren't white until 1870. Then from 1870 on until the 1930s, you couldn't naturalize. You could not become an American citizen if you came here from somewhere else on the planet unless you were black or white. One of the people I talk about in the book came as a student, Bhagat Singh Thind. Came in 1915. He was a college student. He volunteered to fight in World War I and was promised at the time of his enlistment that he could become a citizen when he finished his hitch. They even let him wear his turban because he was a Sikh. They let him wear his turban with his doughboy's uniform. War ended. He got sworn in as a citizen, and that citizenship was countermanded by the U.S. Bureau of Naturalization because he was not, under the meaning of regulations, a white person. Bhagat Singh Thind answered, "Well, yes, I am. I'm from Amritsar. I'm an Aryan. So by definition, I am a white person." The 9-0 Supreme Court decision in Thind versus the United States was written by an immigrant from England who said that the common man would not see Bhagat Singh Thind as a white person. Yes, I know all about this Aryan jazz, Persians, North Indian Mughal civilization, all that stuff. The common man will not see this person as white. Therefore, we do not take him as white. Therefore, he cannot be a citizen. He did not become a citizen until 1935, where, God bless him, he tried again for a third time and was finally sworn in. There were no less than 35 cases that went to federal courts of appeal around the country where people tried to establish their whiteness in law so they could become citizens. We have a lot of history that is not taught, not known by most Americans, not talked about, certainly not talked about in high school American history. And in 2045, Virginia Dare 2.0 is going to be born. The person who flips the demographic needle permanently.
Yeah.
When Americans will no longer be, in a majority, the descendants of European immigrants to the United States. That moment is feared by the guys with the Home Depot torches. And part of what I'm demonstrating in the book is that they don't need to fear that moment.
Right. So in demonstrating that, what you do is storytelling. You humanize immigration by telling stories of these people, like the person you just mentioned. Then you talk about the immigrant experience and the migration experience, and you say something here which I thought was really interesting because it's not all negative, right? It is with a perspective of you don't worry about this. It's one where you say, and I'm going to quote you, "America is transformative. It makes those who come here into something new, a new people. We give too little credit to the immigrants for being open to that transformation and too little credit to America for making that alchemy happen. It's not the physical journey to America, it's the psychic one." I love the alchemy sort of expression here. Expand on that. And it seems like there's hope for you, right?
If you talk to anybody who's been here a while, and I've been talking to a lot of them, I always at some point in the interview say, "Have you been to your hometown?" And they say, yeah, I used to go a lot. Now I don't go so often. I don't know very many people there anymore. Or they'll have a story and say, "Yes, I was just there 2 years ago, and I didn't feel at home there anymore. Or I didn't recognize the place. Or I went back to the block where I grew up and didn't know anybody there." That world, native-born Americans think the immigrant is still rooted in that world. Oh, is it allegiance? Oh, is it a lot of psychic real estate in the world between their ears? They don't. They're here. Their lives are here. They're committed to here. Their children are here. The work they do is here. And I ask everybody also, are you an American? And the fascinating answers that you get to that question. Some people say, you have to give me a second to think about that. Some people say, absolutely. Some people say, I think I would have said yes right away a few years ago, but I'm not sure now. One guy told me about how he ran down to Dulles Airport with a bunch of other demonstrators when the Trump administration introduced the Muslim ban. A lot of people clamored to airports around the country to basically say, that's not us. That's not what we do. He said, if you had asked me before then, I would have had no hesitation. Now I'm not so sure.
So we've got about 15 minutes to ask questions. I'll end with one later, but do people we'll set aside 15 minutes? Paul.
Okay, thank you very much. This is fascinating. I want to go back to the part where you were talking about journalism and the news and how it's unrecognizable today, and I agree. And I'm not that old, but I'm probably somewhere in the middle. I mean, I remember Dan Rather and Walter Cronkite and things like that. And I'm not sure, I guess the question is this bad or good? And it's probably neither. It's too soon to tell. But there are some benefits to this, I think. There's an egalitarian nature to things. There's for all the damage and bruises of Twitter, there's an accessibility for people to information. Maybe Wikipedia is the better example. It's extremely well vetted by the crowd, but that crowd is pretty disciplined, I would argue. And so I'm just curious, I guess the way to ask the question is, are you generally optimistic? Are you too soon to tell, or pessimistic about the arc?
I'm glad you asked that question. I'm glad you asked it in that way, and I'll tell you why. My first job in television, when I was a LA correspondent for CNN, I went out with a cameraman, and he had the camera unit. That was about $27,000. The lens was about $17,000. So on his shoulder, he carried a $44,000 camera. You and I could go to Best Buy tomorrow morning, I think we've missed it for tonight, and buy a camera for less than $1,000 that takes a better picture. Actually, the phone in my pocket takes a better picture. And the wonderful thing about that is that it's democratized access to the tools of gathering and storytelling. And the ability to upload your own stories, the explosion of YouTube, the explosion of podcasting has all contributed to the feeling that many more people have that if they have something to say, they can say it, but also be heard saying it, or be read, or seen. That's very important. When across the vast country, you went to most places in America and there were only 3 television stations. Sometimes there was a fourth, an independent, which showed reruns of the Andy Griffith Show and cartoons. If you had a great story about your town and you turned up at one of the TV stations and said, here, it's already here on film or on video, they weren't going to show it. They'd say, who are you? Or they'd quietly look at it and then send their own person out to shoot the same thing. The democratization of access to eardrums and access to eyeballs that has been midwifed by a technological revolution is constantly underestimated in its impact. I think it's tremendous. But along with that, we destroyed the business model for the old media, and it's really not clear how to make a living as a journalist. And journalists are not missionaries, they're not mendicant monks. They are people who need to make a living so they can pay their bills and eat and maybe even raise children. The attempt to rewire and rebuild the engine of a jumbo jet while it's at cruising altitude over the United States has been terribly destructive to the news business. There are fewer people making a living as a journalist now in America than there were 20 years ago, and think of how much more stuff there is out there. So it's unleashed a tremendous explosion of creativity and access and inventiveness, and that's been great. But it's also destroyed the business model that made it possible for news organizations to cover the vital things not only on the other side of the planet, but also on the other side of town.
Other questions? Ron?
In one of Philip's opening questions, one of them was your judgment about China's invasion of Taiwan, and you were pretty fast on that. Would you care to dilate a bit on that? Because you went on to talk about the demographic, economic, social pressures on Xi Jinping. He's walking a tightrope, and the military's got its own voice. Why are you so confident?
I think that even in the current moment of this muscular, bruisey confidence about their power and their ability to project power where they want, they realize that that would upset the apple cart in a way that has far more cost than it has benefit. So if the United States does not openly defy them on publicly insisting on Taiwan's autonomy, they will let things be. Saber rattle every now and then, stick out their chest and beat their chest every now and then, but invade the island and take it over, I'm not a clairvoyant. I just don't think it's going to happen based on the current set of facts as they are. Xi and Biden had a long bilateral at the recent G20 and came to some meeting of the minds about how they were publicly going to discuss Taiwan. And I think it's going to bring down the temperature. People were crazed about Nancy Pelosi's visit. And I had to give people...
Were you there at that time?
Yeah.
Okay, so what do you think?
Well, I had to give people quick thumbnail tutorials in American constitutional order. Like one Chinese professor said to me, "Why didn't Joe Biden tell her she can't do that?" I said, "Because Joe Biden can't tell her she can't do that." How come she was so wanted to show us up over Taiwan? I said, "You really ought to read up on Nancy Pelosi. She's been complaining about China for 30 years, not just when she became Speaker of the House." So she was a long-time critic of human rights abuses in China. She opposed letting China into the WTO without winning concessions over human rights. This is a very old fight for the former Speaker, and for all that, it still ruffled a lot of feathers on the mainland.
And MFN, most favored nation status back in the 1994, and then Nancy Pelosi. I feel like Nancy Pelosi, once they said you can't come, she had to go.
Well, yeah.
Right? I mean, come on, right? Okay, there was someone else I think had a question. Yes, your name is? And Valina, hold on one second, so people can hear your question.
I have so many questions for you, Ray. Long-time listener, big admirer. I have an interesting question. Recently,
I'll be the judge of that.
Okay. So I'm an immigrant from Iran. I gave a presentation or a talk to my children's school when they were discussing immigration and U.S. history and whatnot. And one of the students who thought was asking a very insightful question, she asked me, how did you cross the border? And when you got here, how did that feel for you? I said, I am an immigrant. I got here by jet, 747 or whatnot, I don't know. So I don't know exactly what you mean. So there's this misconception that all immigrants cross the border. So what kinds of, and these are children raised in San Francisco, in affluent families, very elite schools, highly educated environments, and they have these, have you come across those kinds of discussions among the populace where there is this misconception? And what does that really say about this whole immigrant story and how it's gotten so muddled up?
Well, the American news business doesn't do a very good job explaining the realities of the immigrant population in the United States. most people didn't cross the border. Most people who are living here out of status arrived by plane. Most people who are living here out of status arrived legally, and over time, when they overstayed their visas, were then out of status, were living here, working here illegally. There is widespread misconception of who's coming, from where. A lot of Americans don't know that a majority of Latinos in the United States, now that there are 65 million of them, they should know, are native born. So frequently they'll say stuff like, oh, when did you become a citizen? Like at birth. But it's very common. We focus so much on the southern border, and there is an amazing human drama playing out on the southern border. But a lot of people aren't aware. They think it's all Mexicans and Central Americans. They aren't aware of the huge number of Senegalese, Ukrainians, other West Africans. They fly to Brazil and they make their way overland to Ciudad Juarez or Tijuana. It is an international pool of the restless and on the move that's turning up at that border. It's not even Mexicans in the main anymore, not even close. So there's something going on. I mean, huge numbers of Cubans. The administration, the previous administration, and this current administration, they've changed the laws. Wet foot, dry foot is no longer the law. If the old incentive to just set your foot on American soil, which sent people on those terrible rafts across the Florida Straits, once they made it to Florida, they were in automatically. That's gone. So they are taking cheap, visa-free flights to Managua and making their way overland to the southern border. It is a diagnosis of the state of the world, what's going on in the southern border. We're not telling that story properly or well because there are so many other problems with what's going on down there. Inadequate numbers of magistrates, inadequate numbers of courts, lines that stretch on into infinity, waiting for hearings and processing, that people don't even realize who it is that's showing up at that border. But still, even with what's going on the border now, most people who are in the country, working here, living here, undocumented, did not come across any border. Not from Montreal, not from Vancouver, and not from Nogales, and not from Tijuana. They came by airplane,
So
like you.
We have time for one last question. Steve, I think you wanted to. Hold on. We have a.
It's on. Very interesting. I just wanted to know whether you could give a couple of words on China's relationship with its other Asian powers, Vietnam, Japan, India, and Korea.
That particular assortment that you just named, those are particularly contentious places. Japan, there's a lot of sympathy, cultural affinity, but the Japanese government worries a lot about security. It's arming up. They are changing military expenditure and changing training, changing the posture of their forces. So Japan looks very worriedly at the rest of its neighborhood. Vietnam, I mean, the two countries fought a war in the border in living memory, and they have very difficult, testy relations, and Vietnam is poaching Chinese factories. Labor costs are rising in China. The squeeze, the demographic squeeze that was created by the decades of the one-child policy is starting to come home to roost. You're going to see rising labor costs there, and also this, well, we can dictate the terms, we can take you or leave you attitude. And a lot of companies are going to say, all right, that's fine. We'll go to Vietnam, we'll go to Singapore, we'll go to Indonesia. And that's already underway. India's kind of, yeah, it is complicated. And the Chinese attitude toward India runs really oddly hot or cold. It depends on the moment, and depends on who's asking, and it depends on what they're talking about. So, interestingly, India is about to become the most populous country on the planet. The Chinese population just declined for the first time since the famine around the Great Leap Forward. There are tantalizing trends underway in China, which, there's just really no way to know how they're going to all play out. But it is remarkable to one of the, my son lives in Shanghai, and I met a lot of his circle of friends, 20s and 30s people, and I would always ask them, do you have any cousins? And it was remarkable to talk to all these people who have no cousins, no aunts, and no uncles. Multiply that by millions and millions, and that's an interesting social landscape.
Yeah. Okay, with that was the last question. Ray, thank you very much.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
So,
You'll have me back when the book comes out.
Yeah, we'll be back. So let me also thank all of you. For those of you who are supporters of us, thank you very much. We depend on you. If we are here for you. And if for those of you who are coming for the first time, welcome. Please join. Okay. Also, listen to our podcasts. Listen to Ray's podcast. Listen to ours. World Affairs is on Shifting Ground. It's a new title. Ray is now the official host. I used to be a co-host and realized it was much too hard to do on a regular basis. I so much respect the kind of work that you do on a regular basis, getting this thing out once a week. It's amazing. And Ray, let me just say thank you for just sharing your experiences with us. I know that being the center is not necessarily a comfortable thing for anyone, but particularly a journalist of your caliber, to be the story is really hard. And I wanted to thank you for taking that time. Let me end with this kind of thought for you. There's this thing that I sort of laugh about. I know Ray. There's so many people who say that, right? And there's we have a Global Philanthropy Forum here. And there's one partner of ours who's well known, and she's an immigrant. And she said when she came here to the United States, she heard your voice regularly on NPR. And she equates
and now
that,
speaks with a Brooklyn accent.
Yeah. And she told us that when she heard that you were one of our colleagues, that she associated you with America, associated you with being comfortable and being welcomed. So I'd like to think that that's what you are for many millions more. And thank you for taking the time for being with us. And thank you all for being here. We're all done.
Thank you for coming.